He's nothing but a rusted-out old boat mechanic who still smells like diesel, Your Honor. Derek Voss said it loud, and he said it smiling, like he was ordering coffee. The court reporter's fingers stopped over her keyboard mid-word. The clerk, who had been stapling a stack of forms, set the stapler down without finishing the last page, and the small metallic click of it not closing sounded enormous in that room. Nobody coughed. Nobody shifted in their chair. Somewhere behind the bench, an old wall clock kept ticking, and for 3 or 4 seconds that ticking was the only sound in the entire courtroom, steady and stupid and indifferent to what had just happened to me. I sat very still with my hands folded on the table in front of me, the same way I used to stand at attention on a flight line 30 years earlier, and I thought, that's the kindest thing anyone's called me all year. Because for a man who spent 40 years with grease under his fingernails and salt water in his boots, being compared to a piece of scrap iron nobody wants to haul away isn't an insult. It's just a Tuesday. My name is Harold Doyle. Everyone who's known me longer than a week calls me Hal. I was 64 years old the morning that sentence got said out loud in a Carteret County courtroom, and I'd been married to Carol Doyle for 31 of those years. Right up until she decided, somewhere around her 58th birthday, that 31 years wasn't the life she'd meant to sign up for. I want to tell you exactly how we got to that morning, but first you should know one thing about me, because it matters for everything that comes after. Before I ever touched a Marine engine or rebuilt a single hull, I was a Marine. Gunnery sergeant, 22 years, 2 combat tours, 1 hurricane rescue, nobody outside, a small circle of men ever heard about. I didn't know it yet, sitting there while Derek Voss grinned at me across the aisle, but in about 11 minutes, one of the last people on earth I expected to walk through that door was going to remember exactly who I was. If quiet men who keep their word for decades speak to you, stay with me to the end of this one, because it takes this man 20 years to finally get the credit he never asked for. I grew up 3 miles outside Beaufort, North Carolina, in a house my father built with his own hands, after he came home from Korea missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and most of his patience for nonsense. He used to say a man's worth wasn't in what he said about himself. It was in what other people said about him when he wasn't in the room. I didn't understand that sentence until I was almost 50 years old. My older brother Dennis didn't come home from Vietnam in 1969, and by the time I turned 18, the Marine Corps didn't feel like a choice I was making so much as a debt I was paying. I served 22 years. I retired a gunnery sergeant in 2001, came home to the coast, because that's the only place that ever felt like mine, and I opened a small marine repair yard on a bent little inlet outside Beaufort that everybody just called Doyle's. Wooden hulls, old diesel engines, the kind of boats nobody makes parts for anymore. I was good at it. Better than good. There's a particular kind of patience it takes to listen to an engine that's dying and figure out exactly which part of it gave up first. And it turns out the Marine Corps had already trained that patience into me pretty thoroughly. I met Carol in 1993 at a church potluck in Morehead City. She had flour on her sleeve from a pie she'd carried 3 miles in the summer heat, and she laughed so hard at something I said about my own cooking that she had to set the pie down on somebody's tailgate before she dropped it. She told me later she liked that I didn't talk much, because it meant when I did say something, it usually meant something. For a long time that was true of us. Not movie happy, real happy. Sunday dinners, a boy named Tommy who grew up smelling like fish and diesel because he spent every summer at the yard with me, learning to sand a hull the right way, learning that if you rush a repair, the ocean will always find the seam you cut corners on. 29 years old, married, and I still remember teaching him to fold a flag right. My father's hands guiding mine, guiding his. But boats aren't the only things that develop slow leaks. After I retired from the Corps, something in me had trouble coming all the way home, even though my body did. The nightmares didn't stop the way I expected them to. Loud engines backfiring sometimes made my hands shake for no reason I could explain out loud, not even to myself. There's a particular sound, metal striking metal at a certain pitch, that still puts me somewhere else entirely for 4 or 5 seconds before I can pull myself back. Carol used to ask what was wrong when it happened, and for the first 10 years, I told her nothing, because I genuinely believed telling her the truth would just hand her a weight she hadn't signed up to carry. I was wrong about that. I understand now that the silence itself was the weight, and I made her carry it anyway, just without ever telling her what it was. Doyle's Marine Repair did fine for years, not rich, but fine steady, the kind of business that pays a mortgage and puts a boy through community college and doesn't ask questions. What Carol didn't know, because I never told her, was that in 2015, a man from a land development company came out to the yard and offered me an amount of money for that little half-acre of waterfront property that would have changed our lives completely. I said no. I didn't tell Carol about the offer, partly because I knew what she'd say, and partly because that inlet was the only piece of ground on this earth that had never once made me feel like I was somewhere else. I put the deed to that property, and everything I'd built on it, into a trust in my son Tommy's name the following spring, quietly, through a lawyer 2 counties over, because I wanted to make sure that whatever else happened to me, that yard would still be there for my grandkids to smell diesel and salt on their hands the way I did. I never told Carol that either. I understand now how that looks. At the time, it felt like the only kind of love letter a man like me knew how to write. Somewhere around 2019, Carol started spending more of her Saturdays at open houses and charity auctions with women from her real estate office, women whose husbands owned car dealerships or half of a golf course, and I think slowly, without either of us noticing exactly when it happened, she started being a little embarrassed by the smell of diesel that never quite washed off my hands. That's when Derek Voss started showing up. He was a land developer, 46 years old, expensive watch, a laugh that carried across a whole restaurant, the kind of man who shakes your hand a half-second too long, so you know he's decided something about you already. He and Carol met through the real estate office. I found out 11 months later, not because she told me, but because Tommy drove down from Wilmington one weekend, sat me down at my own kitchen table, and told me he'd seen his mother's car parked outside Voss's condo on the Sound at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I didn't yell. I want you to understand that about me, because it matters for everything that happens later in this story. I have never once in 31 years raised my voice at Carol Doyle. I asked her, quiet as I could manage, sitting across from her in the kitchen where we'd eaten 10,000 meals together, whether it was true. She looked at the tablecloth for a long time before she nodded. I didn't know it yet. Sitting there with my hands flat on that table, trying to keep them from shaking. But that conversation was the last calm conversation the two of us would have for almost a year. She filed for divorce 4 months later. I didn't fight it, not out of weakness, but because I genuinely believed a man doesn't chain someone to a life they've already decided they don't want. I let her keep the house in town. I offered to split my pension straight down the middle without her lawyer even having to ask. What I didn't offer, what I never once mentioned, was the yard. Because the yard wasn't mine to give away anymore. It belonged to a trust in my son's name, set up 4 years before Derek Voss ever bought Carol Doyle a glass of wine. And neither Carol nor Derek knew that yet. That's what brought us to the courtroom that Tuesday morning. Derek Voss showed up not as a witness, but sitting in the gallery directly behind Carol's attorney, close enough to lean forward and whisper things in her attorney's ear during the proceedings, which I later learned wasn't exactly against the rules, just deeply, obviously improper, the kind of thing a judge, with less patience, would have thrown out of the room in the first 10 minutes. Her attorney, a sharp young man named Preston Wade, had spent the first half hour of that hearing painting me as a man who had, in his words, emotionally withdrawn from his marriage for the better part of a decade while quietly hoarding assets his wife had every reasonable expectation to share in. I sat there and let him say it, because some of it, honestly, wasn't wrong. I had withdrawn, I had hoarded in a sense, though not the way he made it sound. And then, right at the end of his cross-examination, when he asked me flat out whether I'd rather see my ex-wife with nothing than let her so much as look at the property where I'd spent 30 years of my life, Derek Voss leaned back in the gallery seat, laughed loud enough for the whole room to hear, and said that sentence about Diesel and Rust that started this whole story. I looked at Carol for a long second after he said it. She was wearing a pale green blazer I didn't recognize, and she wouldn't meet my eyes, which told me more than any testimony had all morning. Then I looked up at the bench, where the judge, a man I hadn't looked at closely until that exact moment because I'd been too busy absorbing the insult, had gone very still. He'd been reaching for a glass of water when Voss made his joke, and his hand had stopped halfway there, hovering, forgotten. I watched the color drain slowly out of a face I suddenly, impossibly, recognized. 22 years older than the last time I'd seen it, but unmistakably the same face. Judge Raymond Ellis. I said his name quietly, not loud enough for the gallery to hear clearly, just loud enough for it to carry the 15 feet to the bench. Raymond. It's Hal Doyle. He set the water glass down without drinking from it, and his hand was shaking slightly when he did. For a moment he only stared. The way you stare at something your mind insists can't actually be standing in front of you. Then his face went from pale to something closer to stricken, and I watched 22 years fall off a 60-year-old judge's shoulders in real time. My God, he said, quiet enough that only the front rows caught it, but I saw 3 court staff members turn their heads at the sound of a district court judge's voice cracking mid-sentence. Preston Wade looked from the judge to me and back again, and I watched real panic land on his face for the first time all morning, because up until that exact second, cross-examining a broke old boat mechanic had apparently been the easiest work he'd done all month. Derek Voss's smile stayed frozen on his face, a beat too long, the way a smile does when a man senses something has shifted in a room, but hasn't figured out yet what it is or whether it's aimed at him. Judge Ellis cleared his throat twice before he managed to speak at a normal volume. We're taking a 15-minute recess, he said, and his gavel came down with less force than the rules probably called for, more like a man setting something down carefully than a man ending a session. Bailiff, he added, please ask Mr. Doyle to join me in chambers. Carol's face, when I glanced at her one more time before I stood, had gone from confusion to something I hadn't seen there in years. Uncertainty. Genuine uncertainty. About a man she'd apparently decided, sometime in the last few years, she already had entirely figured out. I followed the bailiff down a narrow hallway lined with framed photographs of former county judges, men in black robes staring out of another era. And I remember thinking that hallway smelled exactly like every government building I'd walked through in 22 years of service, old paper and coffee left too long on a burner. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They'd started shaking the moment Voss said that word, rusted. Because there's a particular pitch to a certain kind of laughter that puts me somewhere I don't like going, and it had taken every bit of discipline I had left to keep my hands still on that table in front of the whole courtroom. Nobody in that room knew that about me. Carol used to know it, a long time ago, before she stopped paying attention to which sounds made my jaw tighten. I didn't know it yet. Walking down that hallway toward a judge's chambers, I'd never once expected to see the inside of, but in about 90 seconds, a folder was going to come out of a desk drawer that would change the entire shape of that hearing, and eventually, though I couldn't have guessed it standing there, the entire shape of the rest of my life. Chambers smelled like lemon oil and old carpet, bookshelves stacked too deep, a small brass ship's compass sitting on the windowsill, catching what little afternoon light came through the blinds. The door had barely clicked shut behind us when Raymond Ellis crossed the room in 3 quick steps and put his arms around me. Not the careful half-hug men give each other at funerals, but a real one, both arms, the kind that presses all the air out of your chest for a second. You saved my life, he said into my shoulder, and his voice broke clean in half on the word, life. I stood there with my arms coming up slow to return it, because that particular kind of contact isn't something I do, easily, not even with my own son, but something in me recognized this man before my mind fully caught up. Some part of me that remembered exactly what his hand had felt like, clamped around my forearm in black water 22 years earlier. He pulled back, wiped at his eyes with the heel of his hand like he was embarrassed by it, and sat down heavy behind his desk. I searched for you for years, he said, after I made it out. I wanted to find you, thank you properly, and then life just kept happening on top of itself. Law school, the bench. And one day I looked up and it had been 2 decades and I still didn't know your last name. I told him I'd transferred out west not long after, then 2 more deployments. And somewhere in there a man stops looking backward because looking backward gets expensive. He nodded like he understood that completely, which he probably did, because judges sees men who've stopped looking backward walk through their courtroom every single week. September of 2002, Hurricane Isabel came through the Carolina coast like something with a personal grudge. I was a young gunnery sergeant then, stationed at Camp Lejeune, part of an emergency response detachment helping coordinate evacuations along the Sound. Raymond Ellis, 29 years old at the time, a junior federal prosecutor working a corruption case involving a shipping contractor, had gotten caught out near Cedar Point when the water rose faster than anybody's models predicted. His car stalled in rising floodwater at Tununu Lane Bridge Road, and by the time our unit got the call, he'd been clinging to a battered street sign for the better part of 40 minutes. One arm wrapped around an elderly woman he refused to let go of, even as the current kept trying to peel her away from him. Our CO gave the order to hold position until first light, because sending a raft into that kind of current in the dark was, by every reasonable measure, a bad idea. I didn't hold position. I've never been entirely sure whether that was instinct or stubbornness, and by this point in my life I've decided the two aren't as different as people like to pretend. I took 2 young Marines out in an inflatable raft into water that had stopped behaving like a street and started behaving like a river. Rain coming sideways hard enough to sting, a transformer somewhere down the line, throwing blue sparks into the dark every few seconds like a strobe light nobody asked for. I remember yelling at Ellis that when I told him to let go of the sign, he needed to let go of the sign, and I remember him yelling back that he wasn't letting go without her. I respected that instantly, even soaking wet and furious at him for making the rescue harder than it needed to be. We got them both into the raft on the second attempt. A wave nearly flipped us clean over on the way back, and I tore something in my right shoulder, hauling Ellis over the side that never did heal right. Still lights up like a struck match every time the weather turns cold, which is, come to think of it, most likely why my hand had shaken, reaching for that water glass of my own back in the courtroom 22 years later. Some old injury, remembering a storm. Ellis reached into his desk drawer and unwrapped something from a square of soft cloth, setting it gently on the desk between us. My old Marine Corps challenge coin, the one I'd pressed into his palm in the back of the ambulance that night, told him something about how surviving means you owe something back afterward. I hadn't seen that coin in over 2 decades. You told me to remember that, he said. I've kept it in this desk every single job I've had since law school. He asked me, quiet now, careful, whether I'd threatened Carol at any point during the marriage, whether I'd hidden assets to hurt her, whether there'd been any abuse in that house in 31 years. I answered every question straight, no. That's what I assumed, he said, and something in his shoulders eased slightly. Like a man setting down a weight he hadn't realized he'd picked up on my behalf the second he recognized my face. Then he opened a second drawer and pulled out a folder considerably thicker than I expected, and he set it on the desk without opening it yet, just resting his hand flat on top of the cover like he wanted me braced first. Frank, he said, then caught himself, laughed once at his own mistake. Hal, sorry. Old memory got tangled with a name I read in a file once. He explained that a few years back, after his elevation to the bench, a young Marine had come through his courtroom on an unrelated matter, recognized the name Doyle from a conversation years earlier, and mentioned, almost in passing, that Gunnery Sergeant Doyle had been the reason he was alive at all. Ellis, curious, had quietly reached out to a few contacts at Lejeune to ask whether that was the same Doyle. Word apparently traveled in a way I never knew about, because over the following 2 years, without my ever hearing a whisper of it, 7 or 8 more people had reached out to his office wanting to make sure somebody official knew what I'd done for them. He opened the folder. Handwritten letters, some on lined notebook paper, some typed and folded soft with age. A young corporal who wrote that Gunny Doyle had sat with him on a curb outside a bar in Jacksonville in 2009 and talked him out of doing something to himself he wouldn't have come back from. A widow whose mortgage had gotten quietly paid for 6 months after her husband's boat went down in a squall 2 winters back, money that showed up in her account with no name attached, though she'd eventually pieced together whose yard the wire transfer traced to. A recovering Marine who credited an anonymous payment for a 30-day program to the same man. I looked away from that page fast, because reading your own name in another man's handwriting describing the worst night of his life does something to a person's throat that's hard to control in front of a judge you haven't seen in 22 years. You kept all this, I said, because it was easier to say than anything else. People don't forget men like you, Doyle, he said, and for the first time since I'd walked into that room, he sounded like a judge again instead of a man remembering black water. This whole proceeding out there, he said, nodding toward the door. Everyone in it thinks this case is about money. I don't think it is. I think it's about dignity. And I think somebody in that courtroom has been mistaking your silence for weakness for a very long time. I sat with that for a second, because it was the truest sentence anybody had said to me in about 4 years. When we walked back out together, the room had gone quiet. In that particular way, rooms go quiet when everyone senses something happened behind a closed door that they weren't allowed to witness. Carol looked nervous in a way I hadn't seen from her in the entire proceeding, her confidence from that morning replaced with something closer to doubt. Preston Wade stood immediately. Your Honor, before we resume, I have to place on the record my concern regarding the appearance of— Judge Ellis raised one hand, calm, unhurried. Counselor, this court remains entirely impartial, and if you'd like to formally move for recusal, I'll rule on that motion right now, on the record, and we can discuss exactly why I deny it. Wade sat back down without finishing his sentence. Derek Voss, still seated in the gallery, had adjusted his expression into something more careful, but I caught him leaning over to whisper something to a young woman I hadn't noticed before, seated one row back, dark blazer, a leather folio balanced on her knee. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know. Sitting there watching Voss murmur something to her that made her jaw tighten, that she was going to matter enormously by the end of this story, more than almost anyone else in that room. The hearing resumed with an hour of financial testimony, pension statements, the appraised value of the house in town, numbers read aloud in the flat voice lawyers use for numbers, and I let most of it wash past me, the way you let weather pass over a boat that's already weathered worse. Wade tried one more time to rattle me, asked whether I'd agree my military service had left me, in his words, psychologically compromised in ways that damaged the marriage. I told him the truth. I said I'd carried some things home from 22 years of service that I didn't always know how to put down, and that I regretted every single year I'd let Carol sit across a table from a man who wouldn't tell her why his hand shook sometimes. Carol's eyes went wet at that, and Voss, from the gallery, made a small sound that might have been a scoff, quiet enough that only the people close to him caught it. But Judge Ellis caught it too, and I watched him make a note on the legal pad in front of him without looking up. Court adjourned until the following afternoon. Outside, the sky over the Sound had gone the color of wet slate, that particular Carolina September heaviness that means rain is coming whether the forecast admits it yet or not. I was half across the parking lot toward my truck when I heard my name. Hal. Carol stood by her car, purse clutched against her chest with both arms the way a person holds something they're afraid of dropping, and for just a second, looking at her standing there in the gray light, I saw every version of the woman I'd married all layered on top of each other at once. The girl with flour on her sleeve at a church potluck. The mother teaching Tommy to fold laundry to Wheel of Fortune reruns. The woman across from me right now who I genuinely no longer fully recognized. What happened in there? She asked. Old debt, I told her. From a long time ago. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, she said. Maybe he did, I said. Rain started. Light at first, tapping against the hoods of parked cars. She hesitated a long moment, like she was deciding whether the next question was worth the cost of asking it. Who are you, Hal? She finally said, and I understood. standing there getting slowly soaked in a courthouse parking lot that, after 31 years of marriage, that might genuinely be the saddest question Sispert could ask another. I'm the same man I always was, I told her. No, she said quietly, shaking her head. I don't think you are. I think I stopped paying attention to who you were about 10 years ago, and I never noticed I'd stopped. The rain came down harder while we stood there, and for a moment neither of us moved to leave. She asked what had happened during that hurricane, which told me Ellis's clerk or someone in that room had already let a piece of it slip. People got rescued, I told her, keeping it simple. The way I always kept things simple with her, and watching her face, I understood for the first time in years exactly how much damage that habit had actually done. That's it, she asked. That's it, I said. Why won't you ever just talk to me, Hal? She said. And her voice cracked on the last word. And there it was, finally, the real wound underneath every argument we'd had for a decade. Not the money, not even Voss. Just 3 decades of a man who never learned to say out loud what was happening behind his own eyes. You want the truth? I asked her. Yes, she said. The truth is, I stopped knowing how to explain myself a long time ago, I said. And somewhere in there I think I convinced myself that not burdening you with it was the same thing as protecting you. And I understand now those aren't the same thing at all. She wiped at her face, rain and something else mixing together on her cheek. I thought you'd stopped loving me, she said. I never did, I told her. Not once. I just got tired, Linda, and I didn't know how to say that out loud without it sounding like an excuse. She stood there a long moment more, rain soaking into that pale green blazer, and then she said something I hadn't expected. Derek told me you were hiding money from me, she said quietly, that there was property, something in Tommy's name, that you'd moved things around so I'd never see a dime of what we built together. I felt something cold settle in my chest at that, not because it was entirely wrong, but because of how she'd learned it, and from whom. That yard's in a trust, I told her, careful with the words, set up years before Derek Voss ever existed in either of our lives. For Tommy, because I wanted to make sure our grandkids would still have a place to learn what saltwater smells like, even after I'm gone. It was never about hiding anything from you. It was about protecting something for him. She was quiet for a long moment, processing that, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. Some old suspicion reorganizing itself into a different shape. How does Derek know about a trust I didn't even know existed? She finally asked, mostly to herself, and I watched her face change again, watched a version of doubt land on her that hadn't been aimed at me at all. We stood there another minute in the rain, not talking, and then she got into her car and I got into my truck, and I drove the 15 minutes back to the yard with the wipers, working hard against a downpour that had turned genuinely serious by the time I pulled in. I sat in the truck in the driveway for a good 10 minutes before I went inside, hands resting on the wheel, listening to rain hammer the hood, thinking about a folder full of other people's handwriting sitting in a judge's desk drawer, and about the woman I'd loved most of my life standing in a parking lot asking who I even was. I didn't know it yet, sitting there in that truck with the engine ticking as it cooled. But the next morning, that courthouse parking lot was going to be a great deal more crowded than anyone in that case's legal filings had any reason to expect, and Derek Voss was about to learn exactly how much rope a man can hand a person before that rope quietly runs out. Morning came up gray and close, the kind of low sky that makes the whole coast smell like salt and something electric. I got to the courthouse 40 minutes early out of habit, and I noticed the trucks before I noticed anything else. Old Fords, a couple of dented Chevys, one battered green Harley parked crooked near the curb like whoever rode it hadn't cared much about the lines. Men stood around in the drizzle drinking coffee out of foam cups, ball caps pulled low, a few leaning on canes. The particular stiff-shouldered posture of men who've spent decades carrying more weight than their joints were built for. I didn't understand what I was looking at until one of them turned and saw me getting out of my truck. "Morning, Gunny," he said, and my stomach dropped a little, because I recognized that voice before I recognized the gray beard attached to it. Eddie Torres. I hadn't laid eyes on him in 11 years. Not since I'd spent half a night in his driveway, talking him down, after his second divorce nearly put him somewhere. I wasn't willing to let him go. He crossed the lot and shook my hand with both of his, the way men do when a handshake isn't really enough for what they're trying to say. Heard what happened yesterday, he said. Figured a man shouldn't have to walk into that building alone twice in a row. Behind him, more men were arriving, parking crooked, nodding at me one by one. I recognized most of them eventually. A kid I'd once talked out of driving drunk off the base outside Cherry Point, 20 years older now. With a gray in his beard he hadn't earned yet at 19. A man missing 2 fingers on his right hand who'd learned to rebuild an outboard motor at my yard for free the summer his unemployment ran out. A widow, Ruth Calloway, whose mortgage I'd quietly covered for half a year after her husband's boat went down, standing there under a black umbrella like she had every right in the world to be there, which she did. You boys are going to cause a scene, I told Eddie, and he grinned wide enough to show the gap where he'd lost a molar somewhere along the way. That's the whole idea, Gunny. We walked into the courthouse together, not loud, not a march, just a slow line of quiet men and one woman filing through the metal detector and taking seats in the gallery behind where I'd be sitting. I saw the security guard's eyebrows go up. I saw a clerk lean over and whisper something to another clerk. And I saw, when Carol walked in a few minutes later and stopped cold in the doorway at the sight of that gallery, something crack open behind her eyes that I hadn't seen there since the day I proposed to her on a dock in 1994. Preston Wade looked considerably less comfortable than he had the day before. He kept glancing back at the gallery every few minutes, the way a man glances at a dog he isn't sure is friendly. Derek Voss arrived a few minutes after Carol, and this time he wasn't alone. The woman I'd noticed whispering with him the day before came in beside him, dark blazer, same leather folio, and this time I caught her name when Wade greeted her at the door. Vanessa Kern. I didn't know yet what that name would come to mean by the end of the day, but something about the careful, watching way she took her seat, 3 rows back and slightly apart from Voss, made the hair on my arms stand up a little. An old instinct from another life that had kept me alive more than once and had never once been wrong. Judge Ellis entered, glanced once toward the gallery full of veterans, and I saw the corner of his mouth twitch before he brought the room to order with a gavel that landed harder than yesterday's. Testimony resumed with the last of the financial matters, pension division, the appraisal on the house, numbers I let wash past me the way I always did. Then Wade stood, adjusted his tie, and turned toward me with the particular energy of a man who thinks he's about to land a finishing blow. Mr. Doyle, he said, isn't it true that you transferred title of a valuable piece of waterfront commercial property into a trust specifically to shield it from your wife during divorce proceedings? I told him the truth, plain as I could make it. I said the trust was created in 2016, nearly 6 years before Carol filed for divorce for our son, and that at the time I set it up, divorce wasn't a word either of us had spoken out loud in that house. Convenient timing regardless, he said, and I watched Judge Ellis's jaw tighten slightly at the editorializing, though he let it stand. And isn't it true, Wade continued, that you never disclosed this trust to your wife at any point during your marriage? That part was true, and I said so. I said I'd made a private decision, a mistake maybe, born out of wanting to protect something for my grandchildren, rather than out of wanting to hide anything from Carol. So you admit you kept secrets, Wade said, pleased with himself. I looked past him at Carol for a second before I answered. I said, everyone in a 31-year marriage keeps something, counselor. The question that matters is whether what you kept was meant to protect someone or hurt them. That's when the courtroom door at the back opened, and a young woman I hadn't seen in almost 4 years walked in fast, out of breath, dark hair coming loose from a ponytail, and stopped just inside the doorway, scanning the room until her eyes landed on Derek Voss's back. Meredith. I knew her the second I saw her, though it took me a second longer to remember exactly how, because the last time I'd seen Meredith Voss, she'd been 22 years old, standing waist-deep in cold water beside a swamped runabout with a dead engine 3 miles up the Sound, crying, no life jacket, no phone signal, and about 40 minutes from real trouble when I happened to be running my own boat past that stretch of water on my way back from a parts run. I hadn't known then whose daughter she was. I still barely knew now. I'd towed her in, dried her off in my little office at the yard, fixed her engine over the following weekend for free. Because she was a broke college kid and her father, she'd told me at the time, without much affection in her voice, wouldn't have noticed if she'd drowned out there. She stood at the back of that courtroom for a second, breathing hard, and then she said, loud enough to carry, "Dad, stop." Every head in the gallery turned. Derek Voss twisted around in his seat, and for the first time since I'd laid eyes on him, I watched something other than smug confidence land on his face. "Meredith, not here," he said, low and sharp. She walked forward anyway, right up the center aisle, ignoring the bailiff who half rose from his chair before Judge Ellis waved him back down with 2 fingers. "Curious now. He's not the villain in this story," Meredith said, her voice shaking but not stopping. "That man," she pointed straight at me, "pulled me out of the Sound 4 years ago and never told a single person about it, never asked for anything. Fixed my boat for free out of his own pocket, while you were in Charleston, closing a deal you never even told me about. And now you're standing in a courtroom laughing at him. I don't care whose side I'm supposed to be on. That's not who I want to be." The room had gone entirely silent in the way rooms go silent when something real happens in a place built for careful, rehearsed things. Judge Ellis let it sit a moment before he spoke, gently, more gently than I'd heard him speak in either day of proceedings. "Ms. Voss," he said, "thank you. You're welcome to take a seat in the gallery if you'd like to stay." She did, choosing a seat near Ruth Calloway rather than anywhere near her father, and Ruth, without a word, reached over and put a hand on the girl's arm. Voss's face had gone a color somewhere between white and gray, and beside him, Vanessa Kern had gone very still, her eyes flicking once toward the exit like she was calculating something. Wade, visibly rattled, tried to steer the proceedings back toward the financial ledger, but Judge Ellis raised a hand. "Counselor," he said, "I think this court would benefit from understanding a little more about Mr. Voss's relationship to this case before we continue discussing property division. Given that Mr. Voss isn't actually a party to this divorce and yet seems to have opinions about my petitioner's assets that predate this hearing by some time, how exactly did you come to know about a trust, Mr. Voss, that Mrs. Doyle herself apparently didn't know existed until yesterday?" Voss opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I've done business in this county a long time, Your Honor," he said finally. "Careful. Word gets around about waterfront property." "That's a lawyer's answer for a man with no lawyer's license," Judge Ellis said, mild as anything, and a low ripple of something that wasn't quite laughter moved through the gallery. It was Carol who spoke next, and her voice, when it came, was quieter than I'd heard it in years. "I want to say something," she said, and Wade started to object before she cut him off flat. "This is my hearing, Preston, and I'm going to say something." She turned in her chair to face me directly for the first time in either day of proceedings. "Derek told me about that property 8 months ago," she said, "before I ever filed. He told me Hal was hiding money, hiding assets, that there was a whole piece of waterfront worth more than our house sitting there under Tommy's name, and he said it like it was proof I should be angry, proof I should leave. I believed him because it was easier than asking Hal directly, because some part of me already knew I didn't have the courage to hear the real answer." She reached into her purse then and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper I recognized instantly, and my chest went tight the way it does right before a wave hits. She'd found it in the attic 3 weeks earlier, an anniversary letter I'd written 6 years back after a particularly bad winter of nightmares, the year my sleep had gotten so ragged it woke her twice a week, the year I'd sat down at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning and written down every true thing I'd never managed to say out loud, and then folded it into a drawer and never once found the courage to hand it over. "You wrote this," she said. Not a question. I nodded once. She unfolded it with fingers that weren't quite steady and read it out loud right there in that courtroom, her voice cracking on nearly every line. "I know living with me hasn't always been easy. Some part of me never came all the way home from the war, and I've spent 30 years not knowing how to explain that to you without it sounding like an excuse. I loved you before any of that started, and I still love you now, more than I've ever known how to say out loud. When she finished, she folded the letter closed again with both hands and looked at Voss for a long moment, something in her face going hard in a way I hadn't seen since she was a much younger woman standing up to a difficult client at her office. "You told me he never talked to me because he didn't care," she said. "You never once mentioned this letter existed because you never wanted me to find out he did." Voss's jaw worked, but nothing came out. It was Vanessa Kern who finally broke, and not on purpose. Her phone buzzed in her folio, loud in the silence, and in the fumbling to silence it, it slipped from her hands onto the wooden bench with a crack that made half the room jump, and the call connected before she could stop it. Speakerphone blaring for one full sentence before she killed it. A man's voice, tinny and urgent, saying, "Vanessa, tell me the marina deal's still moving. Tell me Voss hasn't blown the whole play falling for his own girlfriend's husband drama." Every eye in the courtroom swung toward her at once. Judge Ellis leaned forward slightly, and for the first time in 2 full days, I watched something like real interest cross his face. "Miss Kern," he said, "would you care to explain to this court exactly what deal that gentleman was referring to?" Vanessa Kern sat very still for a long moment, the dead phone sitting in her lap like something radioactive, and then slowly, she did the thing people do when they've been carrying a lie so long it's grown heavier than the truth. She told it. Not because Judge Ellis had any real legal power to compel her, not as a witness in a divorce that wasn't hers, but because a courtroom full of quiet veterans and a young woman who'd just called her own father out in open court had apparently worn through whatever was left holding her silence together. "I'm a development partner," she said, voice flat. "Coastal Sound Ventures. We've spent 2 years trying to assemble enough waterfront parcels along that inlet to build a marina and condominium project, and Doyle's Yard sits directly in the middle of the last piece we need." She glanced once at Voss, who wouldn't meet her eyes. "Derek's been the face of it locally because people trust him, or they did. When we found out the property was tied up in an irrevocable trust in the son's name, we needed leverage that didn't run through legal channels, because legal channels weren't getting us anywhere. Derek already knew Carol Doyle from the real estate circuit. I suggested he get closer." The word suggested landed in that room like a dropped glass. Carol's face had gone white, then something harder than white, and beside her Meredith Voss had put both hands over her mouth. "You suggested it," Judge Ellis repeated, very quiet now, very careful. Vanessa Kern nodded once, and for a second I watched her realize in real time exactly how much of her own life she'd just handed to a room full of strangers, because she couldn't stand carrying the weight of it silently one more minute. "Derek wasn't supposed to actually fall for her," she added, almost to herself, bitter. "That part wasn't the plan." Voss stood up so fast his chair scraped loud against the floor. "That's not. He started, and then stopped, because there wasn't an end to that sentence that made any of it better." He looked at Carol, and for the first time in 2 days I watched something that might have actually been shame cross his face. "Carol," he said, quieter now, I do care about you. That part was real, whatever else." Carol looked at him the way you look at a bill you already know you can't afford. "I believe you," she said, and somehow that was worse than if she'd screamed at him. "That's the saddest part of all of this, Derek. I believe every word. It just doesn't change what you were willing to do to get here." Judge Ellis let the silence stretch a moment before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had the particular calm of a man who has spent 22 years learning exactly how much weight silence can carry in a courtroom. "Mr. Doyle's trust is not before this court, and neither is a real estate deal that apparently several people in this room have been quietly weaponizing for reasons that have nothing to do with either party's actual legal interests. What is before this court is a divorce, and one straightforward question: whether either party has behaved in bad faith regarding disclosure of assets. I find, based on everything I've heard across 2 days, that Mr. Doyle has not. I find that whatever mistakes were made in this marriage, financial deception on Mr. Doyle's part was never one of them." He turned then to Wade, who looked, for the first time in 2 days, like a man wishing very badly he'd asked a few more questions before agreeing to represent this particular client. "Counselor, I'd strongly suggest a recess for your client to reconsider her position," he said. And I suspect this office will be hearing separately from the State Real Estate Commission about certain matters raised in the last 10 minutes, unrelated to this proceeding. The gavel came down, softer than the day before, more like punctuation than an ending. Court adjourned for the day, and behind me I heard Eddie Torres let out a low breath he must have been holding the entire back half of that hearing. What happened after that unfolded faster than any of it had built. Coastal Sound Ventures pulled out of the Marina project within the month. Once word of Vanessa Kern's own recorded admission made its way, as these things do in a small coastal county, into exactly the wrong ears. Derek Voss's name disappeared from 3 other local development deals almost as quickly, quietly dropped by partners who'd suddenly discovered a strong preference for keeping their distance. I never heard whether he and Carol spoke again after that day. I know he moved out of the county sometime that winter. Meredith stayed. She started coming by the yard some Saturdays that spring, first to help me clear brush along the inlet, then just to sit on the dock with a cup of coffee and talk about nothing in particular. And somewhere in there she became something like family to me, the daughter of the man who'd tried to take everything I had, sitting on my dock, telling me about a marine biology program she was thinking about applying to. The divorce finalized 6 weeks later, fair, simple, no ugly surprises. Carol kept the house in town, which she'd earned honestly enough over 31 years, and I kept the yard, which had never really been mine to give away in the first place. I moved into the small apartment above the workshop, 1 room, a bed, a hot plate, a window that looked straight out over the water. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, the quiet in that room didn't feel like something pressing down on me. It felt like something I'd earned. I started seeing Carol again, a few months after the divorce was final, not the way you'd think. She showed up at the yard one Tuesday afternoon, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop in town, stood in the doorway of my workshop looking smaller than I remembered her, looking in 31 years of marriage, and asked if she could sit a while. I said yes. She came back the following week, and the week after that, and somewhere around the 4th or 5th visit she started actually helping, sanding down an old hull with me in silence for an hour at a stretch, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling because both people in it already understand each other. She told me once, sitting on an overturned bucket with sawdust on her knees, that she used to think my quiet meant I had nothing to say. Now I think it meant you'd run out of ways to say it that didn't cost you something, she said. I'm sorry I stopped trying to find the ways with you. Tommy noticed the change before either of us said anything out loud about it. I can actually breathe around both of you again, he told me over the phone one Sunday, and I could hear his own daughter, my granddaughter Ivy, chattering in the background about something entirely unrelated. Ivy was 9 that year, the kind of kid who asks the questions grown-ups have all quietly agreed not to ask each other anymore. She came down to the yard most Saturdays that Tommy visited, and one afternoon in early October, sitting on the dock with her bare feet dangling over the water while I coiled a length of rope beside her, she asked me straight out, "Grandpa, were you really a hero in the war?" I nearly dropped the rope. "No, ma'am," I told her, careful with it. "Judge Ellis says you saved his life," she said, unconvinced. "Doing your job doesn't make a man a hero," I told her. "Then what does?" she asked. And the question sat there in the salt air a while, before I found an answer worth giving a 9-year-old. "Probably being kind when nobody's watching," I said finally. She thought about that for a long moment, nodded once like she'd filed it away somewhere permanent, and went back to trailing her toes through the water like the whole conversation had settled something important for her. A few weeks after that, Ivy's elementary school held its annual Veterans Day assembly, the kind of thing with folding chairs and bad acoustics in a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and old basketballs, paper flags taped crooked to cinder block walls. Ivy had begged me to come the moment she found out veterans would be recognized, and I'd nearly talked myself out of it 3 separate times that week, because crowds still wear on me in a way I've never fully explained to anyone. But she gave me the particular look granddaughters use when they already know the answer is yes and are just waiting for you to catch up to it. Carol came too. We sat together near the back, Awkward in the specific way two people are awkward when they're rebuilding something slow and careful out of the wreckage of something that broke, while a row of second graders sang a patriotic song, slightly off-key with more enthusiasm than pitch. Then the principal stepped up to the microphone and announced a special guest speaker, and I felt my stomach drop a half second before Judge Raymond Ellis walked out onto that little stage in a dark suit, because of course he did, because that man had apparently developed a real taste for ambushing me in public settings over the past several months. He spoke for a few minutes about service and sacrifice, nothing political, nothing rehearsed sounding, just honest. The kind of honest that comes from a man who's actually thought about what those words mean, instead of a man reciting them because the calendar told him to. Then, near the end, he paused, looked directly out into the gymnasium until he found my face in the crowd. A few months ago, he said, I watched a courtroom full of people underestimate a man because he looked like an ordinary old mechanic with grease under his fingernails. I want you all to know something about strength. It doesn't announce itself. In my experience, the strongest people in any room are usually the quietest ones. Frank, he caught himself, laughed softly at his own mistake. The same mistake he'd made in Chambers months earlier. Hal Doyle. Would you stand up for a second? I sighed, heavy, while Ivy practically launched herself out of her folding chair with excitement beside me, and I stood, slow, feeling every one of my 64 years settle into my knees the way they do these days, and the gymnasium erupted into applause. Not loud, not wild, something softer and more real than that. Teachers and second graders and a handful of parents I'd never met, standing to acknowledge a man who'd spent most of the last 20 years quietly believing nobody was actually paying attention. I looked over at Carol. Her eyes had gone wet, but it wasn't the same grief I'd watched on her face in that parking lot months earlier. This was something closer to understanding, arriving late, but arriving all the same. Ivy slipped her small hand into mine as we walked out into the parking lot afterward, the late afternoon light doing that particular gold thing it does over the Sound in October. Grandpa, she said, proud. Everybody likes you. I laughed. Told her not to trust a crowd too much, and she grinned up at me like she already knew better than to fully believe that either. That evening, Carol drove out to the yard carrying a small wooden box I hadn't seen in years. The one my father had kept his own service medals in. The one Carol had found tucked in the back of the attic while clearing out things from the house she'd kept. Inside sat my folded flag from retirement, carefully preserved, and underneath it, a photograph I'd forgotten even existed, the two of us at that church potluck in 1993. Her with flowers still on her sleeve, both of us laughing at some joke neither of us could remember anymore. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then she said the thing I think we'd both needed to hear out loud for a very long time. I'm sorry I stopped seeing you clearly, she said. And I'm sorry I stopped letting you, I told her. The sun was going down over the inlet by then, that particular gold light that turns the water the color of something almost alive, catching the hull of an old wooden boat I'd spent the better part of the summer restoring, sitting up on blocks near the water's edge, patched and sanded and sound, again after years of sitting neglected in somebody's backyard. There's a particular kind of boat people give up on too early, the kind where the wood looks worn clean through until you actually get down close and realize the hull underneath is solid, that what looked ruined from a distance just needed somebody patient enough to strip back the surface and see what was still good underneath. I've spent 40 years fixing boats other people had already decided weren't worth the trouble, and it took me 64 years in a courtroom full of quiet men in ball caps to understand that somewhere along the way, without ever quite meaning to, I'd become one myself. Ivy ran down to the dock ahead of us, bare feet slapping against warm wood, and called back over her shoulder that the water looked like it was on fire. Carol laughed, a real laugh, the same one I remembered from a church parking lot 31 years earlier, and together we walked down to stand beside our granddaughter and watch the light burn slow and gold across the inlet. 3 generations standing quiet at the edge of the same water that had nearly taken a young prosecutor's life 22 years earlier, the same water that had given me back, in its own patient way, almost everything I thought I'd already lost. And if this story reminded you of someone in your own life, a quiet man carrying more than he's ever said out loud, a veteran, a father, a husband who never learned the words for what happened to him overseas, I hope you'll take a moment today to tell them they matter, while there's still time left to say it. Because the people holding the rest of us together the longest are so often the very ones the world remembers last.